All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Now, sources का हमको last portion cover करना था, and we had to talk about two important things. First of all, Indian historiography, ancient Indian historiography. And secondly, the question whether Indians had any sense of history or not. Ancient Indians, did they have any sense of history? या फिर वो बाद में develop हुआ, right? So first of all, the historiography of ancient India. Historiography का मतलब क्या होता है? The writing of history, right? Historio, that is history, and graphy, that is writing. It refers to the collection of historical opinions or interpretations of any subject or field of history. For example, national movement of India for independence against colonial rule. तो उसके लिए कुछ हिस्टोरियंस उसको एक तरह से परसीव करेंगे, कुछ हिस्टोरियंस दूसरे तरह से. Then there may be some other historians who may come along and may point out specific details that other schools of historians had missed. ठीक है? So historiography actually refers to the collection of historical opinions or interpretations of any subject or field of history. Now, when it comes to ancient Indian historiography, when did the systematic study of ancient Indian history start? कब शुरू हुआ? From the 18th century onwards. किसने शुरू किया? Indians or Europeans? Europeans. Specifically कौन से Europeans? British ने शुरू किया because they had established their empire in India from that point onwards, and they needed a complete understanding of the Indian past so that they could govern India more effectively and exploit her economic resources in a much more efficient manner. ठीक है? And thus, a brand of history writing emerged dominated by colonial historians. This is known as the imperialist or colonial school. Now, the imperialist school of ancient Indian historiography evolved over two stages. In the first stage, a brand of colonial historiography emerged known as Orientalism or Indology. This flourished from the British conquest of Bengal up to the beginning of the 19th century, till the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or I should say till the Industrial Revolution reached a critical stage, right? Now, the changes induced by the British Industrial Revolution and its overtaking of the mercantile activities of the East India Company prepared a new set of objectives for the British Empire in India. In response to this, the perspective of British scholars towards Indian history also changed, and the Orientalist school was replaced by a new school of history writing known as the utilitarian school. ठीक है? Now, this school of history writing dominated the scene dominated colonial historiography from roughly the beginning of the 19th century, 1813 onwards, right up to independence. Now, in response to the colonial school or imperialist school of history writing, some Indians also began responding, and they tried to right the wrongs of colonial historiography. The colonial historians had deliberately tried to diminish the ancient Indians' achievements because they were trying to justify the establishment of British rule. तो जो नेगेटिव स्टीरियोटाइप्स थे इंडिया के, उनको ब्रेक करना एंड टू चैलेंज द ब्रिटिश रूल, एक नया स्कूल ऑफ हिस्ट्री राइटिंग इमर्ज हुआ. दैट वाज नोन एज द नेशनलिस्ट स्कूल ऑफ हिस्ट्री राइटिंग. ठीक है. एंड it dominated Indian historiography from the beginning of the national movement up to independence. After independence, the priorities of India changed. India में अब क्या करना था? Socio-economic transformation लाना था. The country had been torn apart on the basis of religion, तो secularism को strengthen करना था. And the mistakes of ancient Indian historiography in both the imperialist and nationalist schools, they had to be corrected. And the best way forward for this was shown by the Marxist historians. Marxist school emerged for the first time during the 1950s and became the strongest pillar of Indian historiography from the 1960s onwards. Even now it is quite influential. However, इसमें कुछ problems हैं. There are certain things which have been overlooked by the Marxist historians क्योंकि Marxist tools उन areas को investigate करने के लिए properly equipped नहीं है, right? And there are also certain flaws in the ways in which Marxist historians have perceived Indian history. For example, they have taken a very top-down, empire-centric approach. So many areas, many peoples, their histories have been ignored, their histories have been neglected. And in response to this, a new brand of history writing emerged from the 1980s onwards, known as revisionist historiography. राइट. अब इसमें किस तरह की हिस्ट्री के ऊपर फोकस किया जाएगा? द हिस्ट्री ऑफ दोज पीपल्स और रीजन्स व्हिच हैव बीन ओवरलुक्ड. Then subaltern history, that means the history from the perspective of the common people, the history of women, contribution of women to the process of historical change. Feminist historiography आ जाएगा. Then history of those areas which are not given much attention by the earlier schools, such as the regional histories of the deep south or of northeast India or of Rajasthan, etc. Right? तो इन सब के ऊपर अब ज्यादा फोकस होने लग जाएगा. And it is in this manner that ancient Indian historiography has evolved over time ever since its inception with the beginning of British rule up to the present. ठीक है? Now, looking at each of these schools in greater detail. So give the first heading, imperialist or colonial school. What should be the basis of our analysis? क्या क्या चीजें हमको देखनी चाहिए इसमें? First of all, we should identify the important scholars associated with each school. Then we should talk about their motivations or objectives in studying ancient Indian past. Then we should conduct a survey of their positive contributions to the process of history writing. And finally, we should point out the flaws or shortcomings in their historical analysis which became the basis for later challenge by other schools of historians. ठीक है, तो ये पैटर्न हमको फॉलो करना होगा. नाउ अंडर दिस हेडिंग राइट, imperialist historiography evolved under British rule in two stages. A and B. Orientalist or Ontological school from 1757 to 1813, and later utilitarian school 1813 to 1947. क्लियर है इतना? सब हेडिंग दो. Orientalist school. First of all, important scholars associated with this school. कौन कौन, कुछ नाम बता सकते हैं? विलियम जोन्स, चार्ल्स विल्किंस, हेनरी कोलब्रुक, Alexander Cunningham, James Prinsep, etc. ठीक है. Why did they start studying Indian history? What were their motivations or objectives? क्या motivations थे? To learn about Indian society, culture, past, customs, traditions, religion, and law. Why? In order to govern India better. In order to govern India better. ठीक है. At the same time, next point, they wanted to prepare the cultural foundation of British rule confined to Bengal. Why? Because Bengal was already under their control, but they did not want to expand outside Bengal. क्यों? Because it would have involved undertaking a great degree of expenditure, right? और इस समय कंपनी का प्रायोरिटी क्या था? एक्सपेंडिचर को मिनिमाइज करो और रेवेन्यू को इंक्रीज करो सो दैट द प्रॉफिट मार्जिन में बी एक्सपैंडेड. For that, while British rule had to be maintained, preserved in Bengal, British rule outside Bengal was not considered desirable. ठीक है? And how to make British rule acceptable to the people of Bengal? By trying to create the idea that ancient Indian society was extremely advanced but has undergone a process of degradation, decay, right? Because of which the social systems that were responsible for early progress, they are now silent, they are now cold, the engines have stopped. And the rule of the British is necessary to kickstart this civilizational machinery, to remind the Indians of their ancient processes, of their ancient institutions, and to bring them back to that early stage of progress. Okay? To provide an ideological justification for British rule by highlighting its role in reviving ancient Indian greatness. And इसको और कैसे किया जा सकता है? By highlighting the similarities between India's native culture and Britain's foreign culture. तो क्या बोला? Both of us belong to the same stock of people. We are both descendants of the ancient Aryans, right? So further you can write, further an attempt was made to highlight the similarities between Indian and British culture. क्लियर है? राइट. तो ये तो हो गए इनके ऑब्जेक्टिव्स या मोटिवेशंस. व्हाट वर देयर कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशंस to the study of ancient Indian history? First of all, they institutionalized and systematized the study of Indian history. मतलब क्या हुआ? They set up various institutions such as the Asiatic Society of Bengal and the Archaeological Survey of India, which undertook the process of analyzing the Indian past in a systematic manner. The various conventions to investigate Indian history, the various methods, tools, for example, translations or excavations, their interpretations, explorations, etc. They were undertaken for the first time by this set of historians. तो इंडिया में हिस्ट्री राइटिंग का प्रोसेस यहीं से शुरू होता है. दे वर द पाइनियर्स ऑफ हिस्टोरियोग्राफी इन इंडिया. ठीक है. सेकेंडली, दे translated numerous Sanskrit works into modern European languages. For example, the Upanishads, the Hitopdesh, the Bhagavad Gita, and the dramas of Kalidas were translated into English or German or French by this school of historians. So they globalized Sanskrit literature and they were the first exporters of Indian culture and thought to the West. Okay? So they also played a very important role in globalizing Indian culture and heritage. ठीक है. Thirdly, they also highlighted the cultural achievements of ancient Indians, and this would prove to be highly influential later on when, in the context of the national movement, when Indians were looking for inspiration, and where did they look? They looked towards their past. And वो investigation, वो awareness कहाँ से आया? Because of the works of the Orientalist school historians. So this played a crucial role in infusing a sense of pride amongst Indians during the national movement. ठीक है. It is because of the study of history undertaken by this set of historians that we came to know about various episodes of Indian history, which all memory had faded. For example, the Mauryans, the edicts of Ashoka, the concept of Dhamma, the works of Kalidas, lost systems of Indian painting, art, music, drama, etc. They were all revived by this school of historians. ठीक है. So ये तो हो गए इनके contributions. Were there any flaws in their analysis of India? क्या? First of all, since they relied exclusively on Sanskrit literature, they completely ignored the rich volumes of Tamil or Prakrit or Pali literature, which played a very important role in understanding, or which plays a very important role if you want to understand ancient Indian history. Okay? So they emphasized or exclusively relied on Sanskrit literature to understand Indian past. Thus, the picture of ancient India they produced was incomplete and distorted. ठीक है? Now, for their translations, who had they taken the help of various priests? पंडित्स ने यूजुअली इनको ये संस्कृत वर्क्स ट्रांसलेट करने में मदद करी. And since the Sanskrit literature was also created primarily by the priestly class only, इनकी हिस्ट्री राइटिंग बायस्ड होगी या ऑब्जेक्टिव होगी? बायस्ड होगी. किस तरह का बायस आ जाएगा? Elite bias, upper caste male dominated bias is going to come, and as in reflection of this bias, the laws that they are going to create, they are also going to have that same bias. Okay, so an elite bias informed by Brahmanical consciousness seeped into their historical analysis, and the resulting socio-economic, political, and legal systems introduced by the colonial historians. ठीक है? Thirdly, they tended to completely ignore the contributions of Muslims in Indian history, and this created the perception that the medieval age, in which Islam and Muslims played a very important role in shaping Indian history, was a dark age in Indian history. ठीक है? And what was the most important contributing factor for the onset of this dark age? It was the collapse of the ancient glorious Hindu civilization because of Islamic invasions. Since they did not pay any attention to the Arabic or Persian literature of this period, there was very little awareness of the positive contribution of Muslims to Indian society, Indian history, and medieval age was perceived largely as a dark age of Indian history, which had been brought about by Islamic invasions. ठीक? और क्या फ्लॉज हैं? कैन यू थिंक ऑफ एनीथिंग? और समझ में आ रहा है? Now, they had characterized the current Indian society as a decadent and stagnant one. That means जो 18th और 19th century का society था, that was a decadent and stagnant one. It was a backward looking one where superstition was dominating. And क्या reason इन्होंने बनाया इसके लिए? That Indians have always been more interested in spiritualism. They have never been interested in material progress. Is this correct? No. Now that we have a proper understanding of ancient Indian history, we know that a proper balance was always sought between material and spiritual happiness. Okay? So these were the motivating factors, or these were the driving engines behind Indian history, the historical change. But kyunki most of these historians focused upon religious Sanskrit literature, they have emphasized the idea that religion and philosophy were of greater significance to Indians than anything else. They have also distorted Indian history by claiming that Indians were always more interested in spiritualism, and thus they have ignored ancient India's great cultural, political, and economic achievements. ठीक है? And this became the basis for their justification of British presence in India. Kya? That presence of British is going to induce this materialism among Indians. Their life will be more complete. Is this clear? So these were the flaws. Next stage of evolution of colonial historiography took place in the form of the emergence of the utilitarian school. Important scholars include Lord Macaulay Minutes वाला, James Mill, his son John Stuart Mill, etc. ऑब्जेक्टिव्स या मोटिवेशंस क्या थे behind their analysis of Indian history? The emerging needs of the British economy, they had to be fulfilled. One very important economic development had been going on in Britain ever since the second half of the 18th century. यानी कि इस पीरियड के करीब 70 साल पहले से एक प्रोसेस चल रहा था. What was that? The Industrial Revolution. And as Britain industrialized, the role that India had to play in the British economy, that also started to change. Before this, India was the supplier of finished products, especially cotton cloth, to European markets. अब इंडिया को क्या रोल परफॉर्म करना था? As a supplier of raw material to the emerging British industries and as a market for finished British products. तो इंडिया को देना था इन्हें रॉ मटेरियल एंड markets. And how would this be possible? Would it be possible if the British rule in India remained confined to Bengal only? No. And therefore, the emerging needs of the British economy dictated that the British Indian Empire had to be expanded rapidly. Political and military control had to be established over large parts of India, and Indians had to be transformed into consumers of British products. ठीक है? And how to do that? By westernizing Indians. ठीक है? So this period, इस period में आप ये भी देखोगे 1813 onwards that there is going to be a long series of social reform legislations introduced by the British. For example, the abolition of sati, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of female infanticide, human sacrifice, etc., increasing the marriageable age for girls, the spreading of Christianity, the introduction of modern education, etc. ये सब अब शुरू होना होगा. Purpose क्या है? To westernize Indians so that Indians become consumers of British products. Clear? Achha. And for doing that, would the utilitarians continue to praise Indian society as being a developed society in the past? No. So contributions क्या थे इनके? और मोर एक्यूरेटली हमको बोलना चाहिए इनका इंटरप्रिटेशन क्या था? They denied the idea of Indian civilization. They said that the Indian civilization or Indian society is barbaric in the present, it is irrational in the present, and has always been like this only. Okay? So both ancient and modern Indian society were described as barbaric, irrational, superstitious, backward, unequal, and unenlightened. ठीक है? They introduced a concept known as Oriental despotism. To explain the unchanging and permanent nature of Indian society. ठीक है? क्या है ये idea of Oriental despotism? It defines all Eastern systems and societies as changeless societies. That means a society where historical change does not take place. कोई political change नहीं होता, that is कोई change in the political system वो नहीं होता है. No changes in the social systems institutions take place. Economic progress कोई नहीं होता है. Cultural development कोई नहीं होता है. Literary development, scientific development, none of that takes place. The society is clearly divided into the common people and the ruling class. And the ruling class maintain order among the barbaric people by the use of force. So coercive power becomes a very important factor for maintaining order. ठीक है? And in this way, they tried to justify the establishment of British rule and their despotic rule in India. क्या? कि despotism has been the norm for the Indian society. If the rulers introduce too much freedom, then these people are going to fall to their default position. The order is going to fail and the people would be even worse off. So they did this to justify the expansion of British rule. ठीक है? So this was another contribution or interpretation or flaw of utilitarian historiography. Clear? आगे बढ़े. Now they also introduced the concept of golden and dark ages in Indian history, right? And deliberately they highlighted only those phases of Indian history as golden ages जहां पे contribution किसका था? Indigenous people का या foreigners का? Foreigners का, right? Phases of foreign rule were characterized as golden ages. And why do you think they were doing this? Because they themselves were foreign rulers and they were trying to convince themselves and the Indians that foreign rule is going to be beneficial for Indians. उनको डार्क एज में, लेकिन आप मान लो कि चाहे वो इंडो ग्रीक रूलर्स हो गए या कुशान्स हो गए या शाकाज हो गए और दी आर्यंस, दे वर आल्सो आउटसाइडर्स. इनफैक्ट मॉर्टिमर व्हीलर ने तो ये तक बोल दिया कि हरप्पन सिविलाइजेशन भी आउटसाइडर्स ने बनाया था. सेटलर्स फ्रॉम मेसोपोटामिया हैड कम एंड एस्टैब्लिश्ड दैट सिविलाइजेशन. सो achievements of Indians were attributed to foreigners in order to justify the expansion of British rule in India. ठीक है? Then James Mill in 1817 carried out the tripartite periodization of Indian history into India's Hindu, Muslim and British ages. And why had he done this? To deliberately distort and communalize Indian history. ठीक है? Now, another flaw of utilitarian history writing was its generalization and oversimplification of Indian past. And why was this? Because many of the utilitarian scholars did not take active interest in actually studying Indian history. They were operating from their own position. तो वो अपना जो फाइनल डेस्टिनेशन है वो ऑलरेडी डिसाइड कर चुके थे, right? And in order to fulfill that narrative, in order to make that narrative into a reality, they used to selectively choose evidence, and this has resulted in generalizations such as ancient period being called the Hindu age, medieval period being called the Muslim age. तो मौर्यन पीरियड कहाँ पे आता है? एंशियंट पीरियड में आता है. वर द मौर्यन लीडर्स ओनली हिंदू? नो, जैन्स भी थे, बुद्धिस्ट भी थे. सिमिलरली मेडिवल एज में चलो सल्तनत और मुगल्स का तो रूल आता है, बट विजयनगर एम्पायर ऑल्सो कम्स, राइट? व्हाई नॉट काउंट दैट? सो they have made generalizations and oversimplifications of the Indian past in order to write a motivated history. Clear? Now, in response to this kind of historiography, the nationalist school began emerging. कब इमर्ज हुआ? Emerged from the mid 19th century onwards. What was the single biggest contributing factor for the emergence of nationalist historiography? The 19th century Indian Renaissance. और दी सोशो रिलीजियस रिफॉर्म मूवमेंट्स ऑफ द 19th century, उसी का ये ऑफशूट था. सो राइट डाउन, इट वाज एन ऑफशूट ऑफ द 19th century Indian Renaissance. It was an offshoot of the 19th century Indian Renaissance. राइट? ये जो 19th century के सोशो रिलीजियस रिफॉर्मर्स थे, what were they trying to do? They were trying to reform the Indian society in response to the British conquest of India. They understood that India had been defeated by the foreigners because of some inherent weaknesses, internal flaws थे, कुछ shortcomings थी, which had to be overcome. When they analyzed the Indian political, economic and social systems, religious systems, identify क्या किया इन्होंने कि what is the root cause of Indian weakness? The flaws of Indian society, the evils prevalent within Indian society. So Indian Renaissance was itself a response to British colonization. It was born out of a consciousness of defeat. And once the 19th century reformers began identifying the factors behind defeat, where did this investigation lead them? It led them to Indian past. right? Now, what were the socio-religious reformers trying to do? They were trying to reform Indian society, but in doing that, they also understood the need to reform Indian religion. क्यों? क्योंकि सोशल इविल्स और इंस्टीट्यूशंस को सैंक्शन कहाँ से मिलता था, लेजिटिमेसी कहाँ से मिलता था? रिलीजन से ही मिलता था. एंड रिलीजन को रिफॉर्म करने के लिए व्हाट वुड दे हैव टू डू? दे वुड हैव टू गो बैक टू द रूट्स ऑफ द रिलीजन. की फाउंडिंग के स्टेज पर रिलीजन के क्या प्रिसेप्ट्स थे, राइट? What were the institutions that dominated and how we have deviated from those institutions. That is why राजा राम मोहन रॉय हो जाएं, चाहे सर सैयद हो जाएं, चाहे स्वामी दयानंद सरस्वती क्यों ना हो जाएं, हाउ डिड दे जस्टिफाई देयर मूवमेंट्स? रिलीजियस अपील देते थे कि देखो वेदास में ऐसा नहीं लिखा हुआ है, या फिर सर सैयद के केस में दैट अ मॉडर्न लिबरल इंटरप्रिटेशन ऑफ इस्लाम एंड द कुरान एंड द हदीस नीड्स टू बी मेड so that the faith of Islam can be modified to fit the unique conditions of 19th century India and not the conditions of 7th century Arabia when that religion was created. ठीक है? So ये investigation होगा which would lead them to the Indian past. Clear है? So this response to British colonialism was born out of the consciousness of defeat. ठीक है? Now they understood that that India had been defeated by the Western civilization, and they started investigating why. ऐसा हुआ क्यों? And this led them into a deeper investigation of the factors which led them to the Indian past. So past के बारे में Indians में curiosity, consciousness बढ़ना अब शुरू होता है. ठीक है? It is from this growing consciousness of past and with the maturing of the Indian Renaissance that nationalist historiography emerged to challenge British colonialism. ठीक है? Now जो 19th century के reformers थे, what kind of a response were they framing to British colonialism? Social and religious response. On the other hand, जो nationalist historians थे, who began emerging in the backdrop of the rising feeling of Indian nationalism and the maturing of the national movement, what kind of response would they form? An ideological and political response. ठीक है? These included certain important scholars such as A.S. Altekar, आशीर्वादी लाल श्रीवास्तव, R.C. Majumdar, H.C. Ray Chaudhary, M.G. Ranade, etc. ठीक है? So, how would they frame their response to British colonialism? In political and ideological terms, political or cultural terms में, ठीक है? And कैसे करेंगे? For example, पॉलिटिकल एंड कल्चरल रिस्पॉन्स को फ्रेम कैसे करेंगे? अलग अलग ग्राउंड्स पे. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, द ब्रिटिश यूटिलिटेरियन हिस्टोरियंस हैड अलेज्ड दैट इंडिया में कभी डेमोक्रेसी का नामो निशान ही नहीं था. इंडिया वॉज ऑलवेज डिफाइंड पॉलिटिकली बाय द आइडिया ऑफ ओरिएंटल डिस्पोटिज्म. सो दे चैलेंज्ड the idea of oriental despotism, highlighted India as the mother of democracy by shedding light on the ganas of Mahajanpad period, by the republics of the Mahajanpad period, by the local self-governing assemblies of Chola villages, etc. Right? Further, they also told the untold history of foreign invasions and the valiant Indian resistance. colonial historians ने क्या idea establish किया था? That it was very easy for the foreign rulers to conquer India, and this has happened time and time again. They had completely overlooked the resistance offered by Indians. तो इन एपिसोड्स के ऊपर और ज्यादा लाइट डाला, right? They glorified India's martial culture also, and highlighted the roles of personalities such as Maharana Pratap और छत्रपति शिवाजी और रानी लक्ष्मीबाई as national heroes. Equal attention has been given to the cultural achievements of ancient Indians. For example, the literature, philosophy, art and architecture of ancient Indians, that has been emphasized upon. The religious developments in ancient India, that have been emphasized upon to characterize India as a vibrant society, as a society which was adaptable and evolving continuously. So it was a very important tool to destroy the idea of Oriental despotism. Clear hai? Sure. However, there were certain flaws in the nationalist historiography as well. क्या flaws? that although they challenged colonial historiography, they were unable to redefine the parameters of Indian history. For example, they continued. So, for example, they changed the nomenclature of Indian history's periodization, उसको सेक्युलराइज कर दिया था, हिंदू मुस्लिम और ब्रिटिश पीरियड को एंशिएंट मेडिवल एंड मॉडर्न कर दिया था, बट failed to change the basis of this periodization. So, ancient, medieval और मॉडर्न पीरियड्स की जो डिवाइडिंग लाइंस होंगी वो अभी भी पुरानी वाली ही रहेंगी. दैट इज 1206 the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate and 1757 the Battle of Plassey and the establishment of British rule over Bengal. तो चैलेंज किया था, बट दे वर अनएबल टू ब्रेक द मोल्ड ऑफ इंडियन हिस्ट्री प्रिपेयर्ड बाय द colonial historians. Secondly, they also ignored the contributions of Muslims to Indian history and exclusively glorified the Hindu past. ठीक है? Thus, for them, Indian history was Hindu history, Indian culture was Hindu culture, और बाकी सब कुछ फॉरेन होगा. ठीक है? And this led to the Indian nationalism and its historical consciousness was to be deeply tilted, to be deeply colored with the tinge of a Hindu cultural nationalism. And in this way, they had fallen very neatly into the trap that was carefully laid by the colonial historians. They themselves contributed to the communalization of Indian history, which split the two great communities of India apart in a permanent manner. Okay? So they contributed in this manner to the communalization of Indian history. Okay? क्लियर है इतना? और क्या फ्लॉ था? In their eagerness to find inspiring examples among historical figures which could act as role models for modern Indians to challenge British rule, they praised or glorified certain individuals as national leaders, which was problematic and inaccurate. ये हमने अपने पहले लेक्चर में भी एड्रेस किया था. Personalities such as महाराणा प्रताप और छत्रपति शिवाजी और रानी लक्ष्मीबाई को इन्होंने किस तरह से प्रेज किया एज नेशनल हीरोज, राइट. प्रॉब्लम क्या था? दैट दीज पीपल, apart from Rani Lakshmibai, Maharana Pratap and Chhatrapati Shivaji, they were fighting against other Indians. ठीक है. So particularly कुछ Indians की लड़ाई बाकी Indians से उसको फ्रेम किया गया as a struggle between Indians and foreigners, right? So they have also participated in generalizations of Indian history with a political motive, thus leading to its distortion. And this is dangerous also. Why? Because while it strengthened nationalism, it also strengthened communalism. Clear? तो ये flaws हैं. Clear? Now, next set of historians. Marxist school. It gained prominence from the 1950s onwards. Some important Marxist scholars. Who's the founder of Marxist historiography in India? D.D. Kosambi. Followed by R.S. Sharma. और कौन कौन? B.N.S. यादवा, D.N. झा, सतीश चंद्रा, इरफान हबीब, एटसेट्रा. ठीक है. Now, what were their objectives? They wanted to carry out a scientific and systematic appraisal of Indian past to correct the flaws of existing historiography. Then other objectives they were trying to fulfill through their history writing was nation building, creating a secular society, creating a rational society that was progressive and forward looking, and bringing about social transformation by scientifically highlighting the flaws of ancient Indian institutions so that they may be reformed. ठीक है? कैसे किया इन्होंने ये? How did they do this? They applied Marxist tools of historical materialism and historical dialectics to study Indian history. मार्क्स ने क्या बोला? That the history of the world is the history of economic change. ठीक है? And that the history of the world is the history of class struggle. So when we study historical change, we study about cultural, social, and political changes. Do these changes appear out of vacuum या फिर इसके पीछे कोई ड्राइविंग मैकेनिज्म होता है? ड्राइविंग मैकेनिज्म होता है. एंड व्हाट इज दैट? Economic change. So economy becomes the foundation or the substructure over which the superstructure of historical change is erected. It is economic change which induces changes in polity, society, and cultural systems and practices. ठीक है? Secondly, the process of historical change is based on a causal relationship between factors and effects, between causes and effects. ठीक है? So एक dialectical process होता है, and dialectical मतलब कि dialogue type का process होता है. So one dimension of historical change is in response to historical change that occurs in another field. For example, improvement of technology or changes in the climate may bring about changes in the political system, as the ability of human beings to organize, to manipulate their surroundings, to use their resources changes. Their political organization, the basis of their resource, that is also going to change. तो इन्होंने ये करा. ठीक है? Now came the question of periodization of Indian history. So they continued to use the ancient, medieval, and modern periods to divide Indian history. However, the basis of division is now going to change. Right? अब क्या बोलेंगे ये? That ancient और medieval के बीच में चेंज करने का बिगेस्ट फैक्टर पॉलिटिकल चेंज नहीं था, इट वाज इकोनॉमिक चेंज. पहले वाले हिस्टोरियंस क्या बोल रहे थे? पॉलिटिकल चेंज, द एस्टैब्लिशमेंट ऑफ दिल्ली सल्तनत. यहाँ पे पॉलिटिकल चेंज, द एस्टैब्लिशमेंट ऑफ ब्रिटिश रूल. अब क्या बोलेंगे मार्क्सिस्ट हिस्टोरियंस? दैट हिस्टोरिकल चेंज refers to the comprehensive changes in the socio-economic, political and cultural systems. तो पलक झपकते नहीं हो सकता है वो चेंज. इट इज अ कॉम्प्लेक्स प्रोसेस विच टेक्स several years or even centuries, right? वो gradual process होगा. So there is a process of transformation and it is a lengthy process. Clear? और ट्रिगर क्या होता है उसके लिए? इकोनॉमिक चेंज. तो क्या चेंज आइडेंटिफाई करेंगे इकोनॉमी में? द बिगनिंग ऑफ land grants, from the Gupta period onwards to military officials. This led to the emergence of feudalism, characterized by lower trade, higher frequency of warfare, the ending of monetary economy or demonetization of the economy, ending of coinage. Because trade and commerce declines, because the use of monetary currency disappears, are cities going to flourish? No. De-urbanization. And the ruralification and agrarianization of India, right? तो ये सारे चेंजेस हमको देखने के लिए मिलते हैं in this transitional phase, and this process took place over a long period of almost 500 years. So 750 से 1200 CE तक, और इस पीरियड को क्या बोल दिया गया है? इट हैज बीन इंसर्टेड एज अ न्यू फेज इन इंडियन हिस्ट्री, दैट इज द अर्ली मिडीवल एज. तो एंशिएंट के पहले एंशिएंट के बाद अर्ली मिडीवल एज लीडिंग अप टू द medieval age proper, right? Similarly, modernity has also been redefined. तो दुनिया भर में कुछ ऐसे चेंजेस हुए which brought about a set of results characterized by the rise of commercialization of production, which induced the decline of feudalism, and aristocratic power was replaced gradually by the emergence of modern nation states. Where industrialization started taking place. And global trade increased, which created the pathway towards imperialism and colonialism. ये प्रोसेस भी अचानक से होगा? नहीं होगा. And that is why the entire period from 1450s to 1750s, almost 300 साल का period, this is taken to be the transition from medieval to modern. So early modern age भी बोलते हैं कुछ लोग इसको. Clear है? So this is how they began to reinterpret history as a series of comprehensive socio-political, economic and cultural changes which are interlinked with each other. Problems क्या हैं इस historiography में? Flaws क्या हैं? That there are many gaps in Marxist analysis. क्यों? क्योंकि sufficient historical data available नहीं होता है कई बार हर पीरियड की हिस्ट्री को इन टूल्स के थ्रू एनालाइज करने के लिए. सो इन दीज एरियाज मार्क्सिस्ट हिस्टोरियोग्राफी स्टेज कंप्लीटली साइलेंट. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, The history of Northeast India. Or the history of the common people. And their influence on the ruling classes. For example, the role of religion in shaping historical change. Etc. ठीक है. Secondly, the Marxist historians tend to take a top down approach to studying historical change. मतलब they focus upon the activities of the ruling class alone, and even within that जो अलग अलग पीरियड्स अलग अलग एम्पायर्स की हिस्ट्री के लेंस के थ्रू देखे जाते हैं. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, medieval period is going to be, or later medieval period is going to be looked exclusively through the lens of Mughal historiography. So the developments taking place at Delhi or Agra, they would feature most prominently in the minds of the Marxist historians. And what was happening in the peripheries, for example, अवध में क्या हो रहा था, बंगाल में क्या हो रहा था, हैदराबाद में क्या हो रहा था, मराठा एम्पायर में क्या हो रहा था, उसके ऊपर उतना फोकस नहीं होता है. राइट. दे हैव एन empire centric approach. And lastly, और क्या शॉर्टकमिंग होता है इसमें? Since they are reliant upon specific types of evidence, such as foreigners' accounts or written records or inscriptions for analyzing the past, it gives them, first of all, an elite bias, and secondly, it prohibits them from writing about those episodes or periods or people for whom such records are not available. And therefore, it results in an elite bias in their history writing. ठीक. Now, to overcome these flaws, from the 1980s onwards, revisionist historiography has become prominent. The foundations of this school were laid down by the writings of people such as Ranjit Guha, Partha Chatterjee, etc. Some other prominent historians associated with revisionist school include, let us say, Muzaffar Alam, Chetan Singh, Athar Ali, B.D. Chattopadhyay, Who else? Karen Leonard. Sanjay Subramanian. Etc. What has been their main focus? To shed light on neglected areas of Indian history, such as subaltern history, feminist history, history of the regions, etc. They have also challenged the interpretations of other schools in a scientific and a rational manner. Example, B.D. Chattopadhyay has challenged the model of Indian feudalism to the model of integrative politics. ये क्या है? जब हम अर्ली मिडिवल एज कवर कर रहे होंगे इंडियन फ्यूडलिज्म तब देखेंगे. अनदर एग्जाम्पल, रणबीर चक्रवर्ती has also challenged the idea of Indian feudalism by pointing out that demonetization of the Indian economy did not take place to such an extent that it would induce feudalism. ऐसा किसने बोला था पहले? R.S. शर्मा ने. ठीक है. So he in fact compelled R.S. Sharma to revise his own ideas around feudalism. So he challenged the demonetization hypothesis. क्लियर है? कंक्लूजन में क्या लिख सकते हैं हम? The evolution of ancient Indian historiography is a natural, organic, and desirable process. Why are we saying it is desirable? Because there can be no final word in history. अगर ऐसा हो जाता है, that means historical change would has come to an end. And कभी भी historical change खत्म हो सकता है? No. So there is no final word in history, and thus its understanding should also keep evolving. So while it is desirable, ये कंट्रोल्ड तरीके से होना चाहिए, अनकंट्रोल्ड तरीके से होना चाहिए. Historical revisionism touches upon certain very sensitive issues, and thus it must be undertaken in a controlled and systematic manner. ठीक है, इसका rational basis होना चाहिए and empirical analysis होना चाहिए, यानी कि evidence based study होना चाहिए. Generalizations need to be avoided, and at the same time जो प्रोसेस ऑफ पीयर रिव्यू होता है, जिससे एकेडेमिया ऑब्जेक्टिविटी मेंटेन करके रखता है, दैट मस्ट बी फॉलोड. राइट डाउन. हाउएवर, रिविजनिज्म must occur in an objective, empirical, and open manner. That is the way in which we can conclude this topic. Okay? Take down a question. Discuss the evolution of ancient Indian historiography full stop. What are the dominant schools of ancient Indian history? $200 words, 15 marks. ये समझ में आया है? हो जाएगा एड्रेस. Right. Second thing that we needed to address was, did ancient Indians have a sense of history or not? तो सबसे पहले ये जानने के लिए कि था या नहीं था, फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल we must be able to define what we exactly mean by having a sense of history. ये सबसे पहले डिफाइन किसने किया? कॉलोनियल स्कॉलर्स ने, जिन्होंने ये बोला that based on this criteria इंडियंस की राइटिंग्स हिस्ट्री की तरह क्वालिफाई नहीं कर सकते हैं. सो वी आर गोइंग टू यूज दैट सेम क्राइटेरिया फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल. ठीक है. तो द वेस्टर्न हिस्टोरिकल ट्रेडिशन, उसके जो फीचर्स होते हैं दैट वी आर गोइंग टू टेक एज बीइंग द फीचर्स ऑफ अ प्रॉपर सेंस ऑफ हिस्ट्री. क्या क्या होना चाहिए किसी भी वर्क में फॉर इट टू क्वालिफाई एज अ वर्क ऑफ हिस्ट्री? First of all, there should be a proper sense of time. Its chronology should be well established. ठीक है. Secondly, the work must be presented in a manner that the cause and effect relationship between different developments and events is clear, right? So the cause effect relationship or causal relationship between events मस्ट बी रैशनली प्रेजेंटेड. तो ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए कि किसी जगह पर फैमिन आया है तो ऑथर लिख रहा है बिकॉज गॉड वॉज अनहैप्पी विद द पीपल, दैट इज वाई ही smote them with a famine, right? Thirdly, the authorship should be clear. उसके ऊपर कोई डाउट्स नहीं होने चाहिए, राइट? एंड व्हाई इज दिस? बिकॉज वी मस्ट बी एबल टू आइडेंटिफाई कि ऑथर था कौन, किस टाइम पीरियड में लिख रहा था. वी शुड बी एबल टू affix the period in which this work is created. We should also be able to identify the motivations behind the writings of this particular author. ठीक है. So authorship must be clear, right? और क्या फीचर होना चाहिए? फैक्चुअल एक्यूरेसी होनी चाहिए. ठीक है. इट शुड बी फ्री ऑफ बायस, ऑब्जेक्टिव रिपोर्टिंग होनी चाहिए. फैक्चुअल एक्यूरेसी एंड absence of bias, right? Further, there should be no blending of myth and history in a work of true history. So there should be no blending of myth with history. And finally, the work should not be presented simply as a list of events which took place chronologically, right? Rather, the author must give his own critical and objective judgment with regards to why this historical change took place. So it should be a critical or Analytical work. Right? Now, on the basis of this criteria, the works of Greek and Roman scholars such as Herodotus and Livy, the Chinese dynastic records maintained by the court chroniclers, and the Arab and Persian histories, especially after the emergence of Islam, they all qualify as works of true history. ठीक है? Why? क्योंकि इनमें ये सारे फीचर्स अवेलेबल थे, if not in their entirety, then at least in a high degree. However, based on this criteria, Indian literature does not qualify as true historical work. ठीक है? And using this argument, colonial scholars have concluded that ancient Indians lacked a sense of history. Why? Ancient literature के क्या characteristics थे? Primarily किस तरह का literature था? Secular or religious? It was primarily religious. फोकस किसके ऊपर था? फैक्चुअल रिपोर्टिंग के ऊपर या माइथोलॉजाइजेशन के ऊपर? माइथोलॉजाइज समझ गए, राइट? सो फोकस was upon creating a mythico cosmological narrative rather than factual accuracy. Thirdly, chronology का क्या status था? Can it be considered to be strong? No, it was rather weak. इनफैक्ट पुराण्स में, कुछ पुराण्स में ऐसा भी है कि वो फ्यूचर टेंस में लिखे हुए हैं, राइट? सो दे आर डेलिबरेटली रिटन इन द फॉर्म ऑफ अ प्रोफेसी. तो ये सारी चीजें आगे आने वाले समय में होंगी. एंड राइटिंग इज ऑल्सो क्वाइट फिगरेटिव इन नेचर. फ्लावरी लैंग्वेज, फिगरेटिव लैंग्वेज का यूज किया हुआ है. तो फैक्चुअल एक्यूरेसी भी वीक होता है. मिथ को फैक्ट्स के साथ मॉडल किया हुआ है, राइट? So that is why it is considered weak. When it comes to objectivity, क्या वीकनेस है? जो बायोग्राफीज और रॉयल हेगियोग्राफीज हैं, सॉरी सीक्रेट पर्सन की हेगियोग्राफीज हैं, वहां पे बायस विजिबल है, इधर पेट्रनेज बायस और रिलीजियस बायस. As a result of which objectivity is lacking, right? Further, क्या देखने के लिए मिलता है? Are these works analytical in nature? Yes, they are, but only to the degree that analytical investigation drives home this mythico-cosmological narrative. It strengthens this narrative. So rationality has taken a back seat in favor of mythology. Right? So critical analysis is weakened due to mythological analysis. Right? And thus colonial scholars ने क्या बोला? That जो हमने criteria बनाया हुआ है for any work to qualify as a work of true history, ancient Indian literature does not fulfill that criteria. Thus, it would be safe to say that Indians did not have any sense of history. Clear? Now, this became a major field of debate post independence, right? And यहाँ पे pioneering work किया है रोमिला थापर ने. Right? क्या बोला है इन्होंने? That any work which displays consciousness of the past is presented in an organized framework with a proper understanding of time, its scale and progression, is a work of history irrespective of the way in which it is presented. So it does not matter कि factually accurate है या mythologized account है, अगर ये तीन characteristics हैं, so any work would qualify as a work of history. So any work that displays consciousness of the past is presented with an organized framework, has an organized framework, and displays an understanding of time is a work of history irrespective of the way in which it is presented. ठीक है? She has also said that there are two types of historical consciousness. एक तो है externalized history. Right? For example, the writings of the Greek and Roman scholars, Chinese dynastic records, or the Arab and Persian histories, जिसके ये कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स होते हैं. तो इनका पर्पस क्या होता है? हिस्ट्री को पोस्टेरिटी के लिए रिकॉर्ड करना. सो दे आर works of externalized history. They have been written only for the purpose of preserving historical developments for posterity. ठीक, लेकिन एक दूसरा टाइप का भी हिस्टोरिकल कॉन्शियसनेस होता है. क्या? एम्बेडेड हिस्ट्री, जहां पर हिस्टोरिकल रिपोर्टिंग इज डन बट इट इज नॉट द प्रायोरिटी. Historical reporting has a lower priority. Clear? तो इंडिया का जो एंशिएंट इंडिया का लिटरेचर है उसमें क्या देखने के लिए मिलता है? एक्सटर्नलाइज्ड हिस्ट्री और एम्बेडेड हिस्ट्री. एम्बेडेड हिस्ट्री. सो ancient Indian literature is a form of embedded history. Which is visible in writings such as the Vedas, the Itihas-Purana tradition, right? The Dan Stutis, etc. Do we not find mention of peoples, states, tribes, locations, rulers in these works? सब मिलता है, right? For example, वेदास में एक क्लियर पैटर्न एस्टैब्लिश कर सकते हैं हम ऑफ द ईस्टवर्ड माइग्रेशन ऑफ आर्यंस फ्रॉम द अर्ली टू द later Vedic age. In the Itihas Puran tradition, we get to know about the various Mahajanpadas which flourished in the Gangetic Valley and even in the Indus Valley. In the Danastutis, we come face to face with many great kings of ancient India, जिनकी deeds को glorify किया गया है. whose donations and charitable works have been praised by these scholars. तो historical consciousness तो इन सब में मिल जाता है. Do we find the concept of time? Do ancient Indian historians or ancient Indian scholars reflect understanding of time or not? होता है. For example, पुराण लिटरेचर में 2 features क्या थे? The manvantras, right? Sarga, pratisarga, etc. So they had a complex understanding of time which was both cyclical as well as linear in nature. Right? Organized framework में present किया गया है. एक particular beginning है, एक end है. दोनों के बीच में अलग अलग events के बीच में correlations establish किए गए हैं. And did they display consciousness of the past or not? Yes, they did. ठीक है. So इस तरह का जो लिटरेचर है, it qualifies as embedded history. But at the same time, Romila Thapar also pointed out that there were other Indian works which had been completely overlooked by the foreign scholars, by the colonial scholars. जैसे कि the bardic narratives. Bards कौन होते हैं? These are minstrels जो कि ओरली अपने पेट्रन्स की हिस्ट्री, उनके डीड्स और अचीवमेंट्स को रिकॉर्ड करते हैं इन द फॉर्म ऑफ सॉन्ग्स एंड पोएम्स, उसको रिसाइट करते हैं. तो वीर गाथा जो सुनाते हैं. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, पृथ्वीराज चौहान द थर्ड का बार्ड कौन था? चंद्रबरदई पृथ्वीराज रासोस ने लिखा. राइट. सो बार्डिक नैरेटिव्स, these are oral histories preserved by royal bards such as Bhatts, Charans, Maghads, Pauranikas, etc. Right? So when the colonial historians came face to face with such oral traditions, इन्होंने क्या किया? इनको बोला that they do not qualify as works of history क्योंकि लिखे नहीं गए हुए हैं. अरे ये कोई रैशनल बेसिस हुआ रिजेक्ट करने के लिए कि लिखा नहीं गया है तो इसमें बहुत सारे चेंजेस हो सकते हैं? इनफैक्ट इस तरह के नैरेटिव्स में चेंजेस होने की चांसेस कम है बिकॉज इट इज अ पॉपुलर मीडियम, राइट, जो कि पीपल के पास इसका एक्सेस है. तो जितने ज्यादा लोगों के पास एक्सेस होगा सेम स्टोरीज का, उसको मैनिपुलेट करना उतना ज्यादा डिफिकल्ट होगा. लेकिन जो इस तरह की चीजें हैं इनको मैनिपुलेट करना ज्यादा आसान होगा. क्यों? क्योंकि ये किसी महल या मंदिर के तहखाने के अंदर बंद हैं जिनको एक या दो लोग मैक्सिमम देख सकते हैं, राइट. सो इट वुड बी इजियर टू मैनिपुलेट दिस काइंड ऑफ वर्क, दिस ऑर्गेनाइज्ड लिटरेरी वर्क rather than bardic narratives, but they have been ignored. Romila Thapar makes the argument that such narratives should not be ignored, rather they should be taken when we are talking about whether Indians had a sense of history or not, क्योंकि ये best type of externalized history है which records the details of the great achievements of their royal patrons in a systematic manner. ठीक है. They also talk about foreign invaders, They also talk about the other conflicts or struggles that the patrons had to undergo, right? So एक organized manner में हमको पूरा का पूरा narrative बना बनाया मिलता है. Then she also points out another source of externalized history which existed in India but sadly no longer exists. ऐसे कोई discoveries हुई नहीं है. She says that both the Arthashastra as well as Yuan Sang mention that all kings of India used to maintain royal archives. And archives में क्या मिल जाएगा? Historical records which has been recorded systematically in a chronological manner. However, sadly, these records seem to have disappeared. But they should also be taken into account, because if we take them into account, then narrative पूरा का पूरा change हो जाता है. जो accusation लगा था इंडियंस के ऊपर वो पूरा धुल जाएगा उसकी वजह से. क्लियर है? Further, Romila Thapar says that when analyzing India's embedded history, it is necessary to let go, to abandon the Eurocentric approach. She is making the argument that why should colonial historians be considered to be the custodians of history writing? उनको किसने पावर दे दिया कि हिस्ट्री राइटिंग के पैरामीटर्स को डिफाइन करें, राइट? एंड ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ दैट पूरे के पूरे इंडियन लिटरेचर की हिस्टोरिसिटी को ही रिजेक्ट कर दे. सो वी नीड टू let go of our Eurocentric approach towards history writing when analyzing ancient Indian history. And if we do that, it becomes clear that ancient Indian scholars had very different priorities and tastes as compared to Western scholars. ये हमने अपनी पहली क्लास में भी एड्रेस किया था शायद, that for ancient Indian scholars, the purpose of writing was not to record facts for posterity, for the future generations, but it was purpose of writing was to equip the reader with the four purusharthas. क्या क्या है ये? धर्म, अर्थ, काम एंड मोक्ष. So its purpose was to develop the reader intellectually so that he could lead a fulfilled life. He could have a fulfilled life, contentment. That was the purpose, right? So this means that while the historical sensibility of Indian scholars was different, कैन वी से कि इंडियंस में सेंस ऑफ हिस्ट्री था ही नहीं? था, अपना खुद का यूनिक सेंस ऑफ हिस्ट्री था. इट वाज नॉट नेसेसरली द सेंस ऑफ हिस्ट्री शेयर्ड बाय द यूरोपियन स्कॉलर्स. क्लियर? समझ में आया? राइट? तो ये हो गया डिबेट ऑन whether Indians had a sense of history or not. कंक्लूजन में क्या लिख सकते हैं? Therefore, it would be inaccurate to say that Indians had no sense of history. Full stop. No single culture or civilization has a monopoly of history. Sorry, on history. And the Indian intellectuals had their own unique and developed sense of history. Is this clear? Right? क्वेश्चन आया है, सर आर द कैम्ब्रिज स्कूल ऑफ हिस्टोरियोग्राफी एंड कॉलोनियल स्कूल सेम? तो कैम्ब्रिज स्कूल को ही कॉलोनियल स्कूल बोला जाता है. दैट इज वेयर इंडियन हिस्ट्री राइटिंग बिगैन फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम अमंग द ब्रिटिश. उसको दो पार्ट्स में डिवाइड कर दिया गया है अब, ओल्ड कैम्ब्रिज स्कूल एंड न्यू कैम्ब्रिज स्कूल. अब ये जो ओल्ड एंड न्यू कैम्ब्रिज स्कूल्स हैं, दे आर मोर रेलेवेंट फॉर मॉडर्न हिस्ट्री एंड नॉट सो मच फॉर एंशियंट हिस्ट्री. एंशियंट हिस्ट्री में हम अभी भी यही टर्म्स यूज करते हैं, ओरिएंटलिस्ट एंड यूटिलिटेरियन स्कूल्स ऑफ हिस्ट्री. कैम्ब्रिज स्कूल मॉडर्न हिस्ट्री के लिए यूज किया जाता है. ठीक है? ऑलराइट. तो ये हो गया आज का डिस्कशन. इन आवर नेक्स्ट क्लास वील बी टॉकिंग अबाउट द स्टोन एज. तो मैंने कुछ नोट्स अपलोड करवाए हैं, तो 3 नोट्स होने चाहिए। पहला तो सिलेबस है, दूसरा वाला सोर्सेस का, तीसरा वाला स्टोन एज का है। तो एक बार कल पढ़ के आइएगा सो दैट वी कैन गो थ्रू देम क्विकली। ऑल राइट, इफ देर आर नो फर्दर डाउट शैल आई एंड दिस सेशन? ऑल राइट देन, थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम। कल मिलते हैं सेम टाइम 2 बजे से।